This is the 16th module, 16th module of the Applied Linguistics course in the E-Pathshala program of the UGC. This particular module is devoted to audiolingualism. If you remember, I briefly mentioned audiolingualism or the audiolingual method in the 15th module. And I also sort of indicated how it took the direct method to a further kind of elaboration. And in this particular module, we will see, we'll try to examine all the different aspects of the audiolingual method. To sort of underline something that I have said earlier also, that for any method to come into being, for any method to become popular, a large number of sociological, linguistic, psychological, in many cases scientific and technological factors have to converge, political factors have to converge to make a particular method the dominant method of the times. Okay. So keep that in mind, and I think we will understand audiolingualism much better. Notice that when audiolingualism became the dominant mode of language teaching, it was around the 1940s. And the 1940s, and in fact mid-30s and 40s, and then later on, because of its success, it stayed on. The audiolingual approach sort of continued for a variety of reasons, because 40s was a period of world wars, from 1940 to 45, 42 to 45, 1939 to 1939 to 1945 was 6-7 years dominated by the Second World War in the world. And one of the major needs, as I said, the social and political situation, one of the major needs of the World War was to find spies and to find people who could decode languages and codes of the enemy. And that was one of the major challenges, and people again, as in the past, turned to linguists. And this time, a solution which was even a step ahead of the audiolingual method, the direct method, had to be addressed. So there is a sense in which the audiolingual method, where the emphasis was on drill and practice in the oral approach. So you hear and you repeat, you hear and you repeat, you repeat and you hear. This is that kind of drill was the sort of foundation of the audiolingual method, and therefore it was the need of the hour. You would appreciate that audiolingual method was the need of the hour, because you needed to learn so many languages, but it was also important that those languages were learned in a very short period of time, because you needed the spies and the people who would decode the enemy's messages very quickly, and the number of native speakers could not be enlarged. So the direct method, the standard model of the direct method, could not address this issue, and that is why the audiolingual method came into being. Particularly the US government, which finally called the shots, the US government needed people who were very fluent in German, in French, in Italian, in Chinese, in Japanese, in Malay, in all these languages. They should be fluent and they should be able to interpret, and they needed courtroom assistants, and they needed translators who were very fast. And at that time, they developed something called the ASTP. ASTP is the Army Specialized training program. So this program, ASTP, developed in the 1940s, 41, 42, was very special to train people. But what happened was that soldiers and people working in the decoding rooms learned the language very fast. I mean, that particular kind of language very fast. For example, they roped in, the US government roped in 55 American universities into the whole project, and from the beginning of 1943, and they hired, they took the help of a well-known linguist like Bloomfield, and they also started, you know, uh, following the method that linguistics was following at that time to describe languages. The method followed was that you had a native speaker, and you had a bilingual, and you had the Bloomfield, you had the linguist. So it was a triangular kind of thing. So suppose you want to describe Hindi, you wanted a Hindi native speaker and a Hindi English bilingual and a person like Bloomfield, who was a linguist, to transcribe that kind of data and describe the language. And they thought this was the best model to learn through repetition and drill. Now their target is not to describe the language, the target is to learn the language. And they thought this was the best thing, that you have a native speaker, you have a translate, and you go very fast with the audio-lingual approach. So the features of the audio-lingual method, which are there on your screen, and I'll try to explain them to you. Various features of the audio-lingual method were, intensive contact with the native speaker. That was the idea, or somebody who knew the language well. It was based on listening to dialogues among the native speakers, and there was intensive drill of those dialogues. There was no explicit grammar was out. There was no space, no time to teach grammar, and whatever rules or vocabulary were to be acquired, they were to be acquired through these repetition of dialogues and their drill. The purpose was to make spoken fluency possible in a very short time. So there were a lot of repetition exercises. There were substitution drills, substitution drills like I ate an apple, or I ate a or an, and then you say I ate a banana, I ate a mango, I ate. So those were left blank. You substituted and you learned a whole set of fruits, okay, or other things. I ate an ice cream, and something like that. You left the verbs blank, so the verbs were filled in, and you learned a whole set of new verbs. Same thing with adjectives. You learned new adjectives by substituting one adjective by the other adjective, and in this process you also learned the place where the adjective would go, and that is how structures were repeated. And new sentences were created through transformations, very basic kind of transformations, that you took a simple sentence, you made a negative. Then you took 20 simple sentences and you made 20 negative sentences. Did the same thing. So you started sounding like a native speaker in asking questions, in responding to hello, how are you, I'm very well, thank you. You started, because if you are going into a German camp and you are speaking German, the only thing, you are dead either way. Either if your language betrays you. You see, language can betray you in 1 second. If your language betrays you, then the Germans will kill you, and if you are trying to run back, then the people behind you will kill you. You are not wanted either way. So you had to be perfect. The other thing that was to be focused, for example, was the passive transformation. Certain things, for example, in the English language, is said only in the passive. If you want to hide the agent, if you don't want to reveal the agent of the action, if you want to say something like the glass is broken, you know that it is Gita who broke the glass, but you want to hide her name, so then you say the glass is broken or the glass was broken. So you have to learn the passive. Then there were things like there and there, for example, there and their, in the English language. How do we make those distinctions clear? How do we separate them? Or I want to live and I want to leave. Live, live, and leave, leave. They both pronounced the same way, but written very, very differently. The methodological underpinnings of the audiolingual method, they are on your screen, so you can see them on your screen, and I'll try to explain to you what were the methodological underpinnings of for the audiolingual approach. So the foreign language learning, it was believed, is basically a process of mechanical habit formation. So it was believed that uh, the automatic habit formation, if you think about it carefully, then audiolingualism manifested the most celebrated form of behaviorism. Okay, that's what behaviorism said, that language learning should become automatic habit formation through drills and practice. Then language is verbal behavior, that is the automatic production and comprehension of utterances, and that can be learned only by inducing the students to do likewise. So a lot of imitation, a lot of pattern practice, and so on. Language skills are learned more effectively if they can be learned in the target language. Again, no use of the source language, as in the grammar translation method. So language had to be learned by the use of the target language, again borrowed from the direct method. Then instead of teaching grammar and doing analysis, provide analogy. Analogy, if X is running, then Y is running, then Z is running. So if you learn one, then you will learn the rest. And that meanings of the words will take care of themselves if they are in a dialogue, if they are in a context. So don't teach isolated words. Finally, you see the issues of motivation became very important in various kinds of language teaching methods, not just in, for example, the issue of motivation became highly important in war times because it was a question of life and death. It was a question of the honor of your country. It was a question of losing or winning the war. So the motivation was very strong. People have worked a lot on the whole issue of attitudes and motivation, and we may, in one of the modules later, talk in some greater detail about attitudes and motivations. But for the time being, just to introduce you to the different kinds of motivation, Gardner and Lambert, in their famous book called Attitudes and Motivation in Second Language Learning, identified 4 different kinds of motivation. The most powerful motivation was called the integrative motivation. You will learn the language best if you want to become like the target language group. If you are motivated, if I want to learn French and if I want to become a member of the French community, then most likely thing is that I learn the French language very well. The other kind of motivation can be instrumental, that you don't want to be a part of the French community, but you want to get a job either in France or in the French-speaking Canada, in Quebec, or you want to get a job in Delhi in the French embassy. So you learn French for purely instrumental reasons. or you might just be interested in French literature. That's all. That you don't want to do anything else. You want to read French literature. Or the motivation, the other kinds of motivation that were, very briefly mentioned. The main motivations, motivational orientations, they called it, for Gardner and Lambert were integrative and instrumental. But they also talked of resentment motivation and of the manipulative motivation. Resentment motivation is when you learn a language out of resentment. You are forced by your teachers, you are forced by your parents, you are forced by your government, you end up learning it. Many of us and many of the children, students today hate to learn English, but they are forced to learn English, and they often end up learning English because sheer, they keep resenting it, but they learn it. Some people learn language rather quite well for manipulative reasons. Now, spying is, one kind of manipulative, but you can be a medical practitioner, the medical representative who wants to sell his products, to sell the products of his company, goes to a doctor, and he or she learns only that much English which is enough in the medical terminology. Rest can go to hell, doesn't matter. Okay, so he or she acquires that much language through manipulative motivation. And as I explained to you, there was a sort of socio-cultural, linguistic and psychological context to the advent of the audiolingual method, and also there was a growing impatience with the existing methods like the grammar translation and the direct method. The other important thing which I forgot to mention earlier is that Charles Fries had undertaken a very intensive analysis of telephone conversations. Now that provided an input into the audiolingual approach. Now this is how telephone conversations take place. So if you want to talk on the phone as a spy or as a decoder of a coded language, this is how you should be talking. Another important thing that had happened by this time was the development and use of the International Phonetic Alphabet, called the IPA. Now IPA by this time was fully established, and you could write any language in with a finite set of symbols, and any linguist, any trained person could read that language with glosses and could understand it. So this was a kind of universal script invented by the linguists, by the International Phonetic Association, both called IPAs, International Phonetic Alphabet and the International Phonetic Association. The other important thing that happened was, the invention of the magnetic tape, and then its multiplication, the language lab. Now, language lab was at the foundation of the audiolingual method. And even today, you will find language labs rusting across the world. They are, I think, of very little use, only for pronunciation, only for practice and drill. I don't think a lot of real language learning can take place through language lab, but they are there because of these times. The major limitations. What were the major limitations of the audiolingual approach? One of the major limitations of the audiolingual approach was that it completely ignored the reading and writing skills. You just could conduct. If I asked you to write some German, you very proficient in spoken German, you could decode it, and pass on successfully as a spy, get the information. But if I asked you to write 2 lines, you would fail. So, through contact with native speakers, inability to produce and comprehend new sentences. Since the total learning was confined to a finite set of dialogue, the generative capacity in language, where you can understand new sentences and produce new sentences, that was not addressed in the audiolingual approach. Uh, and you needed a bilingual, you needed a native speaker, and as I said in the beginning, audiolingualism was the ultimate manifestation of the behaviorist psychology and of some variety of structural linguistics. You would appreciate that audiolingual method was the need of the hour. You needed to learn so many languages, but it was also important that those languages were learnt in a very short period of time, because you needed the spies and the people who would decode the enemy's messages very quickly.